Everyone, thank you for tuning in to the Postmodern Realities podcast, brought to you by the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. I'm Melanie Cogdill, managing editor of the Christian Research Journal. It's September 2023, and this is episode 359, which is a conversation about loneliness. On this episode, I'm joined by Lisa Cooper, who is a senior copywriter at Relevation Media and a freelance writer at Barna. She has a master's degree in religion from the American Lutheran Theological Seminary. Lisa has written a feature article for the Christian Research Journal. Her article is called The Loneliness Crisis in America and How the Church Can Help. And you can read her article free online at our website, equip.org. Lisa, it's good to have you on the podcast again.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Well, I'm excited for today's conversation because actually this topic has really become kind of an epidemic. Lately, I'm sure everyone has noticed over the last few years, even before the COVID lockdown, that there were more reports of loneliness. And also, even in the UK, they had a government minister appointed to tackle the topic. And then here in the United States, in the past year, the Surgeon General has even written about loneliness. So I feel like it's very much of a current issue on people's minds. And then add on top of that, not just modernity, but also all the isolation people experienced during the COVID lockdown a few years ago. So this has kind of been really something on the minds of health professionals, interestingly, and even government. So I'd like to ask you, first of all, before we start talking about this, is what is loneliness and how has the definition of loneliness, changed over time?
Yeah, so loneliness is a really interesting topic because it isn't defined by something objective. It's very much a subjective experience. And so right now, I think many social scientists use what's called the attributional approach, which was popularized in the 1980s. Prior to that, loneliness was really correlated to social isolation. So were you, by yourself a lot? Did you not have friends? Did you not have meaningful relationships? That was what qualified loneliness. But since the 1980s, there's been this kind of shift in understanding of what loneliness is to be about the gap that people feel between the level of social connection that they have or that they feel that they have and what they feel like they want to have. So there's a distinction between this, like the feelings that you can have and your actual social isolation. So, for example, people with tons of friends can still feel lonely. I think a lot of times you kind of hear this in the cliche, like nobody's as lonely as somebody in New York City, like walking on the streets in New York City surrounded by people. So you can be around tons of people and still feel that, deep longing for more in your relationships. And so there are also people who are very content being alone and they don't feel that social pain, that isolation it doesn't lead them to loneliness. And so I think having this subjective view makes it such a difficult topic to tackle because it's so different for every person who experiences it. So yeah, it has changed over time. And I think right now we're in a position where loneliness really has to do, when people are speaking about it in terms of like social science and all of the things we're going to talk about today, it really has to do with that discrepancy between where you want to be socially and where you feel like you are.
And I think I'm going to be very interested to hear your thoughts, and we'll cover this. Is like you just mentioned, people could be outgoing and lonely, but also people could be married and lonely. So there might be some stereotypes from like maybe somebody who's single thinking, well, if I'm only in a relationship, then I won't be lonely. Or I'm married, I don't have children, but if I had children, I wouldn't be lonely, or some of those things. So I'm interested to hear a little bit more about that. Well, as I mentioned in the intro, currently loneliness has been referred to as an epidemic. And with all these, government positions or government officials speaking out on it, do you think that it's a fair descriptor to categorize loneliness as an epidemic?
So it's interesting. I think this was one of the things I was really wondering about as I wrote this article, which is why I was hoping we'd talk about it. The So an epidemic is something, it has to do with like a widespread occurrence of some kind of infectious disease. And so we are all fairly acquainted with that after COVID-19. And it's, beginning as an epidemic and then spreading and becoming a pandemic. And so when government officials are coming out with articles saying that loneliness is now an epidemic and it's affecting so many people, I think it gets at something very true, which is that loneliness is so widespread. And I focused on America in my article because it was getting too long. So I had to not talk about other places. But the I think in America we're seeing more and more people identify as being lonely. And it is primarily women are more forthcoming about their loneliness, and they'll explain that that's how they're feeling, and men don't, but maybe we'll talk about that later. But there's something about an epidemic or the delegation of epidemic that makes it has to be something that's contagious, right? Or it has to be something that can spread. And it's interesting, this actually didn't make it into the article, because I didn't end up answering this question specifically, but there is an article that came out, like a study out of the Cambridge Institute of Public Health, that says loneliness can be contagious in some way. And it's something that I'm interested in looking more into. But the idea is when you surround yourself with a bunch of lonely people, you tend to take on their loneliness. Or when people are forthcoming about their loneliness, it's something that you can empathize with and feel deeply, especially if you're someone who's really intuitive and tuned into other people's emotions. But at the same time, happiness has been seen to be the same way. And so I think that in some ways, if we're going to talk about loneliness as an epidemic, I think being aware, that who you surround yourself with can impact your outlook on the world and your sense of what's true and what's false. And, if it moderately or severely impacts many people, chances are you are with a lot of lonely people in your life. And I think it is helpful to be upfront about those things. That's how you get a diagnosis, right? That's how you treat an epidemic, is you get diagnosed and you get help and treatment plans and stuff. And I think that's where the focus of this word has kind of come into play, is that, secular sources, government officials, scientists, and now even Christians have been trying to come up with ways, how do we solve this problem? And I think calling it an epidemic makes it pretty clear that this is something that we need to treat, not just something we need to passively accept as the reality. And so I think it's, in some ways maybe it's a little bit overblown, but I do think that there's some truth to it. And I think it's for sure something that grabs your attention in a way that's going to hopefully impact the way that people are talking about it. So, I think in some ways maybe, people are using the term epidemic so that they can get the funding they need to conduct the research that they want to conduct on the problem and potential solutions. But at the same time, those problems and solutions are necessary, right? Like if loneliness affects 3 out of 5 adults in America, to some moderate to severe degree, I think that's pretty important. So yeah, I mean, so yes and no. I think it's an epidemic in some ways, but I don't know that I fully believe that it's contagious in the same way some other kind of illness would be, because we could say the same thing about happiness. And, if you're around a bunch of positive people, you tend to become more positive. So I don't think that that's necessarily the same thing.
If you're a regular listener to the Postmodern Realities podcast, I hope you've been enjoying our very fascinating conversations with our authors this fall. We've just had some very interesting topics, and they will continue on. We've got a movie review of the big blockbuster hit Barbie that's going to come up, and we've kind of got those October themed discussions around Edgar Cayce and also horror films and horoscopes. You won't want to miss our upcoming later in the fall in-depth dive into the history of Planned Parenthood, as well as Lisa will be back with an article on scrolling and doom scrolling near the end of the year. So we hope you're enjoying this. We hope that you will seriously consider partnering with us, because although everything is free online at our website, equip.org, under journal, under Christian articles, everything there that we're doing, all this new content every week is completely free for everyone, and no more paid subscriptions. So it's right there at your fingertips online at equip.org. But we still do have a budget for our journal as we bring you all of this brand new content every week. We'd ask that you think about just giving us a tip. If you could give us a tip of $5 or $10, even $15, we would be so grateful. You can do that very easily at our website. Go to Journal, click on Postmodern Realities Podcast, and at any landing page, you will find the link to give us a tip. Plus, we're always really grateful for your time, really, those ways that you get the word out about this podcast. Really, just tell a friend, text your favorite episode link to them, or email it to them. Just however you can get the word out about the Postmodern Realities podcast, we are very grateful. Now, back to my conversation with Lisa Cooper about the epidemic of loneliness. Well, you're just talking about whether or not loneliness is an actual epidemic, but I'd like you to just talk about first, are there any, mental and physical dangers of loneliness? I think of physical dangers as if it got to be an extreme feeling of despair that, we don't want to minimize anyone who might have thoughts of harming themselves. But what are some of the, challenges, both mental and physical, of loneliness?
So this is something that was really fascinating to look into, because there have been now so many studies done. And I do think that that label epidemic has really motivated a lot of research, which has been fascinating, especially within the last, really since like 2018. This has been on the minds of people more so than before. But I feel like the mental fallout of loneliness, because when you talk about loneliness, it has to do with that subjective social feeling. And the mental effects of that could be things like depression, feelings of dread. Chronic fatigue is something that's kind of looped into that. A lot of people who face depression also face chronic fatigue. Substance abuse has been tied to loneliness, like a desire to kind of numb the feelings of pain that kind of come along with that mental despair. Anxiety is something else that people report feeling a lot when they're also lonely. And then at some of the most extreme ends of things, there's been a noted connection between loneliness and psychosis. And so I think the mental fallout can lead to a lot of, physical outcomes. And as you mentioned, there, self-harm and suicidal ideation, all of those things are kind of wrapped up into the mental fallout of these things. But what's fascinating is that there's also a physical component to this. So there's a meta-analysis that Julianne Holtz-Lundstedt wrote. I guess she's a co-author. There were a few other authors on that study. She makes this claim that lack of social connection and loneliness can bring about health risks, such as like premature death and heart disease as much as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, which is wild to me. So if you're feeling deep chronic loneliness, your health outcomes and your potential lifespan can be affected as much as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And I feel like, as Americans, we have all of the campaigns about, smoking and how bad that is for you. So we can imagine that smoking 15 cigarettes a day would probably be bad for you. Um, but it also, loneliness and social isolation increase the risk of premature death by 26% for loneliness and 29% for social isolation. It can damage your immune system because when you're feeling lonely, it can increase your levels of cortisol, which is a hormone that deals with like fight or flight. And it can actually cause all kinds of immune system responses that are not supposed to be happening, like chronic inflammation. It can, I get loneliness has also been associated with increased risk of disease. So, heart disease, risk of stroke, high blood pressure, dementia, Alzheimer's, all of these things have been connected to chronic loneliness as well. And there was even a study done in 2017 that's really interesting. They had a group, like a control group of people, and they sectioned out kind of the lonely people, and they realized in doing this study they exposed them all to the same cold virus, and those who were lonely were more likely to develop symptoms of the cold virus than those who were not lonely. And and this is not an isolated study. There have been other studies that basically prove the same thing. So not only is your immune system compromised, you're also more likely to develop all kinds of other illnesses that you're exposed to. And yeah, I mean, those kind of the mental and physical fallout of loneliness is so much more beyond what I would have assumed looking into it at the beginning, that there's these negative health outcomes that can be so devastating. And so I think those have been the things that have triggered this whole response, I think, especially from the Surgeon General, to write about loneliness and its effect on the American population. Why do Americans have such bad health? You know, and if loneliness is really as pervasive as their studies show, I think if we're going to deal with loneliness as an epidemic and come up with meaningful ways to mitigate those effects, I think it will ultimately improve health overall, at least in some ways.
So, what are different groups that are affected by loneliness? Is it more prevalent in different genders or age groups, generations, or maybe ethnic groups than others? Or is it something that's really pervasive and it affects a lot of different kinds of people? So, are there specific at risk groups, like for, say, physical illness or mental illness, or even like you were just mentioning, premature death due to loneliness?
yeah, so the most at risk groups for loneliness and the effects that it brings about, from what I've looked into, it looks like elders, like the older generations, tend to have more significant outcomes in terms of health problems when lonely. So, and you think about like how much more, how many more friends they have that have passed in recent years as you get older. That's something that happens more and more. Social connections are harder to maintain, especially if, technology is changing and you're not keeping up with technology as much as you should or could. Um, things take over your life when especially when you're older. If you're going to a lot of doctor's appointments, you don't have as much time for friends. There are a bunch of different reasons why that might be the case. But one of the things I was really interested in looking into this stuff is that men have also been, they chronically underreport their loneliness. So statistically, they may not be credited as having, the same levels of loneliness as women. So women are more forthcoming about their loneliness and will self-report it. But men have, when you look at like social isolation and the way that, and I know that that doesn't, I made a whole point that it doesn't directly correlate to loneliness. But if you look at social isolation numbers, men are really not doing well. They More than half of men say that they're not satisfied with how many friends they have, and 15% say they have no close friends at all. And so, if you are a man in America, especially, it may be that your social circles are much smaller than you'd like them to be, and they may not be self-aware that that is kind of definitionally what loneliness is, this discrepancy between where you want to be socially and where you are. But this is something that's caused a lot of problems in recent years. The suicide rates for men have skyrocketed in the last few years, and I think it's 3.9 percent more than women, which is significant. And so I think when you're looking at elders and men, those are two kind of at-risk groups that I would flag and say we should make sure, especially as Christians, like in a community, to reach out to those who seem particularly lonely in those kind of groups. But that also is something we can do as a Christian church, is that we can reach out across generations in a way that maybe it wouldn't feel appropriate to do outside of that. If we have this unifying factor as Christians in a church, um, you can have a meetup with one of the older women at church and grab a coffee, and that's not something that is highly unusual. So I bring up these groups not to say like they're worse off or they're doing really poorly or something, but I would be more concerned if I noticed that people were lonely in those groups for those reasons.
So I want to ask, that's just kind of setting the background from just maybe a sociological or maybe even medical standpoint. But as Christians, as we think about this particular, um, maybe not something that you can catch, but maybe crisis, sociological crisis, what's a Christian response to someone who is expressing that they are experiencing loneliness, and what are ways we could, respond to that person and help equip them to respond to people who are experiencing loneliness?
Yeah, so I think that there is something very different about like a ministry approach. If someone came to me and they say, I'm really lonely, I'm feeling terrible about, my friend group, or I don't feel connected to anyone, or I really desire connection in a way that I'm not getting right now. That would be the ministry response would be very different than say, oh, let me tell you about all these stats and statistics about how that's bad for your health, which is the stuff we've covered so far. I do think I do ministry on campus at Cornell University with women there, and I've seen just deep loneliness, especially like among the Gen Z folks that I work with. And when I'm speaking to those women, I'm not going to say, get your act together, go meet some people, feel better, which I think is often the secular approach. Make connections with people, go out, put yourself out there. I would say, you as a Christian, as someone who God has claimed as his own, um, are worthy, you have value. And, I would bring up the Great Commission and how Jesus tells people to go out and, you know, bring the gospel to the ends of the earth and, baptizing and teaching and all these things. But he also says, I'm with you always to the end of the age. So even in our most lonely state as Christians, we have assurance that Jesus is with us. And we see that too in the giving of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit dwells within us as Christians. And that's even closer than another human could be. And so we have these assurances in scripture that God dwells with us and in us and among others in our community, wherever two or three are gathered, there I am. And so I would, first of all, assure them of that, right? There is this objective reality that we are not alone as Christians because we have the Holy Spirit and Jesus says so. But I also would point to the fact that Jesus himself experienced everything we have to deal with as humans. And he, in a lot of ways, has felt loneliness more profound than we could even imagine. Think about how Jesus went before all of his own people and they reject him. And he came to earth to save them. And so he died alone on the cross. And he even says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so in those moments, I'm sure he felt a depth of loneliness that we can't even imagine. But he sympathizes with us and he empathizes with us in our weaknesses. And Jesus, being the one who's with us at all times, we have this assurance that like he understands us. And so when we go to him in prayer and we say, I'm really lonely, I'm really not feeling good about where I am and how things are going, like God understands us. And I think that that's really powerful when we think about prayer and going before the God who created all things and who loves us and knows us deeply and cares for us. He has experienced what we're experiencing. And I think that does give some comfort in the moment. The author of Hebrews says he himself has suffered when tempted, and he's able to help those who are being tempted, right? Jesus has experienced what we experience. And so I think loneliness is something we all experience to some degree, and there are going to be seasons where maybe we experience more loneliness than others. But I do think that in coming alongside other people who are feeling lonely and saying this is not how things are supposed to be, it feels bad right now, but it's not the end. Ultimately, we have perfect unity and perfect community to look forward to when Jesus returns. And so I do think that there is a hope that we can assure people of as Christians that's beyond just get connected, make some friends, feel better right now. And that kind of eschatological view of where we're going as Christians is more of a comfort now when things don't live up to our expectations, I think. But yeah, as far as like practical advice, I think we're going to get more to that later, but I would say in a community, in a church, if you get plugged into your church, there are other people who are also experiencing this or who have gone through profound seasons of loneliness. And I think getting connected to those people is absolutely so important. There are so many people who have experienced more life than us, who have had to deal with all kinds of things that maybe we're in the process of dealing with right now. And there's a lot of wisdom to be gained by just being in community within the church across generations.
Now, I think some people who might be younger would want to know, well, what is the benefit like of finding community and friends in the church? Because of course, there's an app for everything, and I think it's more focused towards women, but there are some dating apps now that have ones for making friends. So Bumble is a dating app for women where they sign up and then they have to allow the guy to contact them or whatever. But now they have Bumble BFF where you can find a friend. So you can put in all your interests and, you can find someone who's willing to text you anytime you need it or different things so that you can maybe someone to travel with or go out to dinner with so you don't have to eat by yourself kind of a thing. So a lot of younger people would say, well, why wouldn't I just do that? Because I could find someone with the same interests. So how does the church in Acts, specifically, I'm thinking of Acts chapter 2, inform our understanding of how to address loneliness and then really call us to something that might be different than if some girls thought I could just download this Bumble BFF and find friends that way.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting thing because when I was in college, I remember my roommate, my first roommate was so different than me. I mean, you think about like polar opposites, right? And we had one thing in common, and that was Jesus. And we ended up becoming best friends. And so I think that there is something more there is something fundamentally different about having a Christian understanding of the world and relating to one another in that way. So, speaking of Acts 2, I'll read this little passage from Acts 2 for those who are not familiar. So it says, this is right after Jesus gives the Great Commission and sends his disciples out, his apostles out. And then there's the meeting in the upper room, and then the giving of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. And then it says, okay, they, the disciples, devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending to the temple together and breaking the bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. And so Christian community looks very different in Acts than I think it does right now. We sort of show up to church on Sunday, maybe, when we feel like it, or we can tune into a live stream of a church service now that everything's kind of gone online. We have that access online. But it doesn't necessarily impact how we live during the week. And I think that that is a problem with a lot of people, for sure. And certainly a huge temptation for most people, where you can just go check the box, say, I've been to church, and then leave. But the reality is, the church was meant to be a community of people who loved and supported one another, and they held all things in common. So, not just physical things, but emotional things. So Paul talks about in Galatians, he says, bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. There's a sense in which we're not only sharing meals with one another, we're not just, and which is one of the things that a lot of secular people have kind of stumbled upon as being a fix for loneliness, eating with other people. Yes, like the apostles did that too, and the disciples did that. And so we have bearing one another's burdens is this, it feels like an amorphous kind of concept. But burdens can be anything, but opening yourself up to a community and participating and doing life together, you're confronted by things that people are struggling with often. And so we have, it may feel inconvenient at the time, but forging those strong bonds with people is fundamental to having a Christian community. So when we gather together, it's not just meant to be about, oh, we sold all of our things and now we live in a commune. That's not necessarily the point here, although I think there are some Christian scholars who would make that argument. I would not. I think the church is meant to be a place where we go to do life with other people. We acknowledge where we're coming from. We're all sinners and we're all in need of grace. And we are in a position where we can come alongside one another when we're struggling with whatever it is. And that includes loneliness. And I think the promise that the Holy Spirit is there, that God Himself is there when we are worshiping together and fellowshipping with one another. I think there's something really powerful and meaningful about that. And, digital church just doesn't do the same stuff. You are isolated. You might be in your room with your laptop, watching a church service, watching people have community, but it doesn't necessarily feel like community when you're abstracted from the gathering of people. And so I think there are studies that have been done that singing, like group singing together, is something that can help alleviate loneliness as well, and that's fundamental to what the church does. There's there are all different opportunities to get plugged into different groups of people and people with different interests. And I do think that there is something valuable about having people who share the same interests. Yes. However, um, you may like the same movies, but if you don't have the same understanding of who you are as a human, made in the image of God and redeemed by Jesus Christ, I don't think that it allows for the same depth of relationship, at least not right off the bat. Like you have to work a lot harder to make a deep connection with someone when you don't have those things already established. And so I think, yeah, we have this great image of what the church is supposed to look like. And unfortunately, I think nowadays it falls short. Like we might look at our churches and go, I'm not getting out of this what I thought I should. But church is not necessarily meant to be a place where we get something out of it. And I know that that's a little bit controversial. Yes, you should hear the word of God preached and, fellowship with other believers and receive communion and witness baptisms. And there are all of these things that happen in the church. But we go there to receive God's gifts, not to feel better about ourselves. So there is something different about forging a relationship among people who understand identity in the same ways that you do as a Christian than just say, abstractify that and say, well, we like the same Netflix shows. We'll just watch shows together. And, that's fun. That can be good, but it's not necessarily meaningful in the same way.
You were talking about Acts chapter 2, and we were talking about, some of the manifestations of loneliness, how people are feeling, or they might have even physical symptoms stemming from like mental health struggles. But what are some of the root causes? Let's go a little bit deeper. What are root causes of loneliness? Because those are just symptoms that are being experienced. What is underneath the feeling of loneliness that people are experiencing?
So there are a ton of different root causes of loneliness, and it can be as different people are. You could have a really close friend who no longer wants to be friends. And I think that's becoming more popular actually. This sort of, well, I don't like you, so we're no longer going to be friends. There isn't as much incentive to work things out now as there used to be, I think. And you know, I hate to use the word cancel, but that is sort of like the verbiage that comes along with a lot of those things, especially among younger people. Just if they're toxic, get them out of your life. So there isn't this incentive to kind of work toward a greater friendships. And I think that holds for like any kind of relationship, is that there isn't motivation for a lot of people to forge those kind of deep relationships that can handle contention or handle disagreements or handle differences of opinion. And so I think a lot of people feel the weight of, my friendships aren't kind of living up to my expectations, but they haven't necessarily created the relationships that can weather those kind of storms. I think lack of social connection is a big cause of loneliness as well. So if you're kind of abstractified from community and focusing more on your connections that you have on the internet, there can be a false sense of community in that way. There's a lot of talk of like subcultures, that you can find on the internet. You can find your true people who like the same things as you or something. But not having a physical aspect to those social connections can cause some feelings of loneliness because you're not actually having the same kind of desired social connection that you might want with the people that you sort of know on the internet. I think feeling undervalued is a big root cause of loneliness. There are people who just generally feel like don't get it. They don't understand them. They don't value them in the way that they want to be valued. Um, And I think, especially in the reading that I did on the elder community, that seemed to really be one of the pervasive things for them. So, maybe their kids don't look up to them as much as they used to, or maybe they're missing out on some of the friendships that they used to have, or they don't feel like they mean as much because they can't do as much as they used to. So feeling undervalued kind of undergirds a lot of feelings of discontentment socially, especially in that age group. And yeah, just I think of the elder community going along with that. Also, the health issues that tend to go along with being an older person, loss of hearing, chronic sickness or illness, chronic pain, and then experiencing death of those around you. Like, I think all of those things compound and can cause a lot of loneliness. But there's also this existential cause, if people are really feeling a that their life lacks purpose, they don't have a feeling of a greater good or some kind of meaning beyond just their individual self, that can cause all kinds of feelings of social pain. So it may be that they feel like they have good relationships and they're happy with their friends, but they don't feel like they're doing anything meaningful. And that's where I think Christians really do have something meaningful to say. Your life does not lack purpose. Like, God has called you to be here and brought you into existence for a purpose. And so when we have conversations with people who are feeling this kind of existential life is lacking purpose feeling, there are ways that Christians can engage with that and bring, the truth that, we're created in the image of God, and we have been made and put here for a purpose, and God is going to use us in this world to help serve others and to participate in community and serve our neighbor and love our neighbor and to glorify him. And so I do think that those aren't all of the root causes of loneliness, but there's certainly quite a few of them. I think it would take us all day if we were going to list out even more than that. But, I think one of the main things kind of going forward, and I'm sure we'll talk about this too, but I think self-centeredness also plays in here, where we have a bunch of people who want things to be all about them and they aren't willing to compromise and put forth the effort to get to know other people in the ways that would actually create lasting relationships.
I think that's an interesting point. I want to segue there because I think that there has been, specifically in the West, a shift in understanding of the self. And what I mean by that, and not just the self, but how the self is related to others. And I'm not just talking about self and identity in terms of sexual orientation, which has been talked about a lot. I just mean in general, the affirmation of the self. On the Postmodern Realities podcast, if you're a newer listener, we have covered this in a lot of different past episodes, including ones on self-affirmations that you say to yourself every day. And also, like, is that biblical? Should Christians do it? And also the huge self-care industry, that we need to focus on ourselves, how we feel, making ourselves feel better, etc., especially when we're having struggles, which might include loneliness. But there is kind of a shift in how we look at self and others that I don't think was around, frankly, during the time that Luke wrote Acts 2. I don't think the people that were, when he was talking about the early church, when they were getting together for, teaching and prayers and fellowship, that it was the same kind of cultural milieu that we have now. And so I want to ask you about that because it seems like it's impacted loneliness. And you said earlier, like, in other words, if you don't like someone, there's other social things that have happened, like, you decide, okay, well, this person is toxic, I'm not going to deal with them anymore. And differently in the church, if there are people that we don't like, well, I guess some people have left churches over that. But I mean, we're supposed to be together in the body with all different kinds of parts of the body and not, I mean, the Christian body couldn't just be all eyes or arms. But I think sometimes in modern life, like you were saying, well, we'd like to find that group on social media of, moms who like to smock and play tennis and all have teenagers or something like that. I mean, some small tribe of people that are just like us. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. And again, like, well, if you don't smock or play tennis, then you're not welcome in this group, because that's what this group is.
Right. Yeah. It is bizarre how people can fragment themselves so much. Um, yeah. So, but I think to answer your question, I would first, I mean, starting with maybe one of the most popular books that came out recently. I think this was in 2020. Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, came out, and I know that he deals especially with the sense of self due to, or like related to gender ideology, but there is something really uh, beyond that he's really getting at when he talks about how the individual used to be someone who was born into a community and had all of the social guidelines for how they were to interact in that community. So if you were born into a family of farmers, you were going to be a farmer, and that was just kind of how things worked. But now we have, as individuals, we have the whole world in front of us. Anybody can be president is kind of like the thing that you hear all the time. And whether or not that's true is a completely different thing. But I do think he traces this whole thing through history, and I would do him a disservice to kind of summarize the whole thing right now. But through different movements in philosophy and in communities, I think we've really shifted, especially more recently, from this sense of an individual participating within a broader community to being the community needs to service the individual, and the individual needs to be their most authentic self, which means that they're not corrupted by this kind of need to conform to social conventions. And so there's this real privileging of being authentic, and uh, whatever that means in terms of like each individual person putting themselves up on a pedestal and saying, I am my most authentic person, and you need to affirm me in who I am, and whatever I'm doing. And if you speak against that, it becomes this problem of dignity. It becomes this like question of whether or not you're a valid human or somebody who deserves time and space and understanding and friends. So self-expression has kind of taken the forefront of the self, is that you're the most yourself when you can freely express yourself, rather than having to kind of hedge yourself in and participate in community in a self-sacrificial way, that you would give up any piece of your identifying features in order to participate in a community that may have different values than you. My husband also wrote a book, and I feel weird because he's my husband, but the True, the Good, the Beautiful. He does a similar treatment on this topic. Not exactly the same, but maybe more broad, about how we kind of lost the sense of, the true, the good, the beautiful, the transcendentals that go beyond self. And so this liberalism that kind of comes up and says, I need to exert, my most true self, or my most individual self, and it's better if people are just affirming me instead of pushing back or critiquing or getting it in a lot of ways that like helps you get better, right? We have that proverb, iron sharpens iron, in the Bible, that friendship is meant to be something that helps create and shape and mold you into something better, and that's how community is also supposed to be. But if we're so rooted in who we are as individuals, and we all we want to do is exert that and you know become our most true selves, the emphasis is all wrong for forging decent and meaningful lasting relationships. And so as Christians, we would say, like, we are not supposed to be doing something that's so self-serving, and we need to exist in this community. Um, and in a lot of ways, like this secular approach, people become tools to affirm us rather than people who deserve our time and respect. And so even affirmation becomes this very surface level thing that is not truly loving the other person. And so I think that this shift in understanding the self in relation to communities has really impacted what people think that they deserve in a friendship or in a relationship in general or in a community, you know. And I think that's why we're seeing so many churches pivot and say, well, we're not really going to talk about sin. We're just going to affirm people. And I think a lot of people are seeking churches that affirm them in whatever positions or passions they have. And I would say that that's not true love. I mean, if you're not, um, calling people into repentance and faith in Christ, then you're not really giving them the real gospel. And so I would caution people to not go to churches that just affirm everything that they want to believe, but that really like pushes and strengthens and, iron sharpens iron you into a better person. Somebody who's maybe not their fullest expression of all of their wants and passions and desires as publicly as possible, but someone who like can get along with other people.
So, do you think, in contrast, that a Christian understanding of the self, or, a Christian anthropology of human beings, makes a difference in our ability to, forge meaningful relationships with other people? Because the Christian view of how we relate to others is so diametrically opposed to the current view of the self, especially when you think of social media, because you think everything online now is 100% about promoting yourself, whether or not you're like a book author or somebody that has something to promote. You're promoting yourself or your family or what you're doing or what you look like or what you're wearing or whatever. So we just have this certain view of self that is almost promotional about who we are, that it should be accepted and embraced. And, how does that differ from a Christian understanding of man?
Yeah. I think even just going back to the very beginning, in creation, God creates male and female in his image. And, as Christians, we throw around the term Imago Dei a lot. But what is that? What it means is that we are actually people who are worthy of all kinds of respect and, relationships. We're created in the image of the triune God who has a perfect relationship within himself. And so when we're looking at other humans, we can forge good community, and we're created to be those who reflect God in this world. That also, it just means we have inherent worth too. We don't have to prove through, social media, self promotion, that we're worthy of respect and love and all of these things. I also think that, when we talk about like a Christian understanding of the self, we can't really discuss who we are as people without also talking about how loved we are by God. Um, I mean, God sent his only son into the world to die for us, to sacrifice himself, to take away our sins so that we can be with him forever in eternity. And so we are worth sacrificing for, um, and loved by God himself, who doesn't need to love us, but chooses to love us. And I think one of the things I like to bring up in a conversation about like who we are and is this quote by C.S. Lewis when he discusses in his article It was a sermon. It was originally preached as a sermon, The Weight of Glory. He says something to the effect of, and I might mess up the quote a little bit, but the holiest object presented to you in front of you is your neighbor. In them, the glorifier and the glorified glory himself is truly hidden. It's amazing when you think about, like, oh, this person that I really don't like that much is actually made in the image of God and will one day be glorified and exist in the presence of God forever with me. I think that really does change how we view ourselves and how we view community and how we view others, because we do have inherent worth and so do others.
I want to know, earlier you were just talking about maybe the falseness of online community. And of course, we've alluded to it a couple of times during the podcast, just the impact of COVID-19, for example. And did COVID-19, with churches going online and all kinds of in-person, whether it's family gatherings or religious gatherings or even gatherings for work and school that were all canceled, did it actually end up causing more loneliness, or were people already experiencing this before maybe it was heightened during that time?
Yeah, so this was one of the most interesting things I found in researching this topic, is that before COVID-19, we had this loneliness crisis happen. And people were really starting to realize that it was a problem. And so, one Cigna study that was done in 2018 and 2019 said that 61% of Americans were lonely, which is an astronomical number. If you think about, lining up 5 adults and 3 of them are experiencing loneliness, that's pretty impactful. But then people took a lot of there were a lot of studies conducted during COVID and pre-COVID and after COVID, because of this loneliness epidemic kind of coming to the forefront of national dialogue before the pandemic hit. Um, and even with all of the government shutdowns, all of the um, personal isolation, all of these things, it there were still the loneliness was increased in some ways and decreased in others, and it still ends up being about the same amount of people saying that they're lonely. And so there were a lot of reasons proposed by, scholars about why this might be. Maybe the people that are lonely were the ones feeling the most lonely during COVID because they didn't have the social network already to tap into. Or maybe it motivated people to tap into social networks that they didn't have before. Or, maybe it was that, like, I think if you had those established lines of communication, you likely could rely on them more. But it's interesting. There were even like meta analyses that looked over all of the different kinds of data and said, it didn't really increase overall since COVID. Loneliness has been a problem and is still going to be an enduring problem. And that's why I think it's so important to talk about it. And I do think that that is something really beneficial that the pandemic did, was that it brought loneliness kind of to the forefront of national dialogue. And even, some of the most admired and popular people were saying, I'm really lonely right now. And, we had a lot of like famous people coming out and saying, like, this is not a good situation. I'm lonely and I'm feeling bad about it. And I think it gave people the permission to really wrestle with loneliness in a way that maybe we hadn't before. But I do think that that also helps those loneliness numbers, So even though, like, looking at all the numbers and stuff, loneliness has not gone away and it's not gotten much worse. It's about the same as before the pandemic. I do think that we have more tools now to talk about it, which I think has been a really good thing overall.
So finally, what are some proposed solutions from a secular point of view that you found out in your research, which of course, we would say really pales in comparison to a biblical approach about how to really address loneliness? I mean, because even the Surgeon General that I mentioned in my opening remarks has talked about how this is something that we need to tackle as a society. So it's interesting. In one sense, everyone's feeling lonely. In another way, medical professionals are saying we should tackle it, but yet there's not a common way that people would agree upon that we could actually do that, especially if most people are really focused on themselves and how to, do the work to make themselves feel better about themselves. So how is a Christian approach different than some of the things that might be suggested from sociologists and others?
It is fascinating to see how, with all of the studies that have been done and all of the scientists doing all the tests and all of these things, they've kind of stumbled upon a lot of the Christians' solutions already. So, be in a community, uh, and serving others is one of the big things that secular people talk about. Fascinating, right? Because as Christians, that is like a huge tenet of what we talk about when we talk about being in community. We talk about serving others, and Jesus is really the basis for that, right? Like Jesus came into the world to serve, not to be served. And so when we as Christians, like it's funny that all of the statistics line up with the things that we would already say to do to mitigate loneliness. um, so there are things like, pick up your phone when people call, minimize your distractions, like reconnect with people. These are all good and valuable things that, from a secular point of view, can help with loneliness. But unless you're going to take that extra self sacrificial step, which I think is imperative to being in successful community and making good relationships and having good friendships, um, and that's advocated by the Christian church, I think that you're going to miss out on a lot of the depth that you can get out of friendship. And so, if Christian friendship is rooted in meaningful community and deep connections where we acknowledge the worth of other people and not just superficially, we don't just acknowledge that they're great the way that they are and affirm them. We acknowledge their worth as people who have been purchased by Christ on the cross and who have been brought into an eternal relationship with Him. Powerful stuff, right? But it sets the example to be self-sacrificial for others, because we have Jesus who has been sacrificial for us. And so, even when we talk about, serving others is a really great way. There are lots of studies that have been done that show like volunteering, decreases all of the negative effects of loneliness, and it helps create those meaningful relationships. But service for the sake of self-improvement or for the sake of self is not going to be the thing that ends loneliness. There has to be that self-sacrificial aspect where we're not only being vulnerable with other people, but we're allowing them to be vulnerable with us. And so, from a Christian standpoint, friendship is and relationships are just so much more than, calling people or texting each other, although those things are good to do. It involves lifting our eyes from our own needs and focusing on needs of the other. And when we get out of this chronic cycle that we have in our culture of kind of navel gazing and just saying like, I need to take care of me all the time, when we do lift our eyes and look to other people and we know to whom we belong as Christians, it does alter our perspective about how to care for others. And I would highly recommend Alan Noble's book, You Are Not Your Own. And he does a fabulous job of diving into all of these topics very thoroughly and much more eloquently than I just did. But I think as Christians, we have this beautiful opportunity to enter into meaningful relationships with others that are able to endure when things are hard, and that are it gives us a reason to like want to sacrifice for others. And ultimately, I think that will, in the long run, produce better relationships that will then mitigate the effects of loneliness. And ultimately, like we know from whom all good gifts come, right? We know that God has given us all of these things. So even the people that have been placed in our lives, we can be thankful to God for. Even if those relationships are not exactly as like fulfilling all of our expectations, I think that that's really powerful, just practicing gratefulness and turning our eyes to God and trusting that he's put us in this position for a reason and that he's going to take care of us.
And I would encourage people to, like you said, that you've had some unexpected friends. I think because we've been so conditioned by modernity and what we think friends should be like or community should be like, that we miss out on some really neat Christian people because we've already judged them to be, not interested in what I like or whatever it might be. Or they might be, oh, well, they're not my same age group, or it might be an older person or a younger person or whatever it is. And so I think when we think about Christian community, it is just so different than how the world sees community. And so I think we need to really be open to what that is, because a lot of times what we're looking for in a church is, again, based on ourselves. Well, do I like this? Do I not like this? Do they have this that I want? Versus that others focus that really Scripture calls us to, right?
Right.
Well, on a much lighter note, it is fall. It's in full swing right now. So, Lisa, are you team apple or team pumpkin? It seems like there's a lot of pumpkin spice around.
Ooh, I'm team apple for sure. I'm not a pumpkin spice fan.
Well, thank you so much for being a guest again on the Postmodern Realities podcast.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to episode 359 of the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Journal. Today's guest was Lisa Cooper. She has written a feature article for the Christian Research Journal, and her article is called The Loneliness Crisis in America and How the Church Can Help. And you can read her article free online at our website, equip.org. Stay connected with the Christian Research Institute and all the new content we have coming your way. The best way to do that is to head on over to our website, equip.org. There you will find thousands of free resources right at your fingertips, from articles to video to audio, and it's all for free. You'll find our podcasts hosted there, as well as the Bible Answer Man broadcast, which is hosted by CRI President Hank Hanegraaff and streams live every Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern. In addition, you don't want to miss out on subscribing to Hank Unplugged, which is the podcast of Hank Hanegraaff. And in that podcast, he has really in-depth, free-flowing, essential Christian conversations with some of the most interesting, informative, and inspirational people. And in addition, he has a new series on his podcast feed called Hank Unplugged Shorts, which Hank goes into the headlines in the mainstream media and refutes a lot of those cultural issues that we have in these short podcast episodes. And there's quite a few of them. You don't want to miss out on them. Now, if you want to find some of this at other places where it's all in one place, really subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a great way to get all of our content there, our podcasts there, and different individual questions theologically that people have that Hank answers at our YouTube channel. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, I don't know how to subscribe to YouTube. I don't have a YouTube account. Well, actually, you might just have a YouTube account. If you have a Gmail address, you have a YouTube account. Just log into YouTube with your Gmail address and search for Bible Answer Man channel, and please become one of our subscribers. In addition, if you see that bell icon right there on our front page, please click that, and every time that we have new content, you will receive a notification that new content is up on our channel for you to be able to consume. So thank you so much for the ways in which you partner with the Christian Research Institute. We are grateful for you listening and reading and watching.